Hello, and welcome to Aviation Deep Dive. A symbol of freedom, the Boeing B-17 has become synonymous with America, bombers, and the Second World War. One of the main faces of US Bomber Command, this now legendary aircraft served in droves, carrying thousands of Allied airmen into the depths of the Pacific and Germany. Appearing on the scene in a world still dominated with biplanes and fabric-covered construction, the Flying Fortress busted open the hangar doors with its sleek, all-metal construction, enormous payloads, and 4 radials, ushering in a new era. Proving itself in combat from before the US even entered the war, to the last days in the skies over war-torn Berlin. In this series, I'm going to take a super in-depth look at the aircraft's development, production, and service life. In this first episode, we're going to mainly focus on the early development of the aircraft, and to better understand how this renowned bomber came to be, we must first go back a lot further than you might expect. Boeing, an aircraft company heralding originally from Seattle, was not always such a giant of aircraft production, establishing themselves more firmly in the late 1920s, with such aircraft as the F-2B and the now much more famous P-26 Peashooter. By the 1930s, the company had begun to expand its sphere of production into larger, more complex transport aircraft, a rapidly growing industry that Boeing struck gold in at just the right time. The Boeing monomail, taking to the skies at the turn of the decade, represented a significant departure from the fabric and wooden-clad biplanes of the previous 10 years. Though it may look a bit archaic to modern eyes, the monomail was exceedingly modern for the time, featuring a low-set cantilever wing, retractable undercarriage, and special attention given to streamlining. The aircraft set the scene for Boeing's next big step forward, the Model 247, cementing the new era of aviation, and there was no going back. Boeing's first all-metal mass-produced airliner, the aircraft had unmistakable similarities to its yet-to-be-designed descendant. Boeing was showing the world how the future of aviation would look. And in fact, the sleek lines of the Model 247 were so ahead of their time that they will be reappearing in the future, so take note of them. The same year that the Model 247 took to the skies saw the construction of Wright Field, expressly intended to assess the feasibility of a heavy bomber concept. The US Army was dead set on developing the capabilities of their bombers, and they were right to do so. For a few short years in the mid-1930s, the bomber would hit the period of its golden age, a result of the understanding of aerodynamics lagging behind the development of aircraft engines. This had the result of bombers being quite temporarily faster than their fighter counterparts. As such, interest in designing and putting into service bombers was very much in vogue. So in 1934, eager to use Wright Field, the US Army issued a specification, simply called Project A. A very straightforward spec, the Army wanted a multi-engine type, with the capability to carry a 1-ton load a distance of 5,000 miles to a target in either Alaska or Hawaii. These guidelines are broad for a reason, and they might stick out to those who are used to more stringent requirements normally seen in World War II era specifications. The reason they were so broad is because by 1934, aircraft were so radically different to how they had been only a few years prior that the best way to go forward with a new design wasn't totally clear. The doors were open for companies to experiment, and for the best layout, construction, and various other factors to become clear through testing. Taking note of their previous successes, the company decided on a mix of new and old, to take elements of what had made their previous aircraft so successful, as well as significant innovation to take the Model 294, later designated XB-15, ahead of its competition. Boeing President Clement Edvet had looked at the multi-engine trend, including trimotors, and reasoned that 4-engine designs were likely the way forward. Putting pen to paper and producing a design that outlined a 4-engined giant of an aircraft, with provisions such as walkways through the enormous wings and a sleeping area for the relief crew, soundproofed and heated. 88 feet in length and 149 feet in span, the XB-15 was in fact the most voluminous and most massive aircraft ever developed in the US up to this point. Taking 3 years to build, in reality the XB-15 was always meant more as a test bed rather than an actual operational bomber, and served primarily to prove what was becoming possible in the world of aeronautics. However, long before the XB-15 ever took to the skies, Boeing had begun work on another aircraft simultaneously, to updated specifications given by the Army. These updated the old specs to include a top speed of at least 250 miles an hour at 10,000 feet, as well as being able to carry a useful load at the same altitude at 220 miles an hour. Also wanting the aircraft to have a climb rate of 2,000 feet a minute, as well as being able to maintain altitude at 7,000 feet with just 3 engines in operation, the updated spec was a significant departure from the original Project A, and competing companies would have to work quite hard within limitations of the time to achieve this. For companies looking to enter the competition, they were given just 12 months to produce an airworthy design ready for assessment, and the winning design was guaranteed a minimum order of 220 aircraft, which was a huge reward and a significant incentive for interested companies. Boeing, having achieved something of a political victory with the awe-inspiring and universally applauded XB-15, was set on winning the contract, and so with $275,000 in state funding for the project, the company put together a skilled team of engineers under direction of Claremont Edvert, and began serious work on what was to be the Model 299 in August 1934. The streamlined success of the Monomail and the Model 247, as well as the XB-15, would play significantly into the design of the aircraft. In fact, the final design would be to a legitimately significant degree an enlarged Model 247, with the engine arrangement, fuselage cross-section, and military equipment taken from the XB-15. I guess if it ain't broke, don't fix it. One of the initial challenges for such a high-performance directive was finding engines capable of giving a 4-engine design the required speed, performance at altitude, and fuel efficiency. The US Army wanted a 10-hour endurance, no small feat. Given the rapid pace of engine development at the time, the team interestingly opted to go for the Pratt & Whitney R1690E, producing about 789 horsepower at sea level. This 9-cylinder radial was not at the forefront of said development. In fact, it wasn't even close. These engines had come onto the scene first in 1926, admittedly in earlier variants, while newer engines such as the R1830 Twin Wasp had their first production run in 1932, and these were producing up to 1,200 horsepower at sea level. Admittedly, they're about 200 pounds heavier and a few inches longer, but it's actually smaller in diameter, and with about a 60% increase in power, it might not be evident why Boeing went for the R1690. Well, the answer appears to be mostly reliability and possibly ease of acquisition. The R1690 had been around for about 6 or 7 years by this point. Mechanics would be familiar with it, there'd be lots of spare parts, and the engine's full capabilities would be well understood. Having only a single-speed supercharger, performance at seriously high altitudes would suffer, but this would become obsolete fairly quickly, and of course in later B-17s this was changed. It was relatively early days for this kind of thing. Regardless, the engines were nacelle-mounted onto the aircraft's wing, which aesthetically mirrored the wing of the Model 247, whilst being built with the tubular strutting from the XB-15, which gave the Model 299 an extraordinarily strong wing design, a trait the aircraft would maintain later in development. Indeed, the wing of the aircraft was an engineering marvel, constructed from 18 subassemblies. The truss web type main spars were capped with sheet metal and gusseted girders. The sections between the spars were given corrugated aluminium sheets, which was stress skin riveted. It was this approach that gave the wing its ruggedness. The 299 was to use a NACA airfoil, and had intended to have ailerons of internal metal construction with fabric skin before it was decided to skin them in aluminium. The cantilever tail, too, would have a fully metal internal structure, but the elevators and rudder were, at least for now, to be skinned in fabric. With very sleek lines, a glazed nose would cap the frontal fuselage, which would itself house a small upper dorsal turret, which actually had 360-degree coverage, extremely reminiscent of the Art Deco school of design. A small window just back and below the glazed nose is given to the bombardier, whilst a cockpit just behind him is sparse, functional, and utilitarian, though reportedly gave pretty good visibility both in the ground and in the air. The Art Deco theme continues further down the aircraft, with the two side blisters intended to house a couple of machine guns. The side blister is somewhat similar to what is seen on a PBY Catalina, although this one offers an enclosed gunnery position, which at 10,000 feet and 20 degrees Fahrenheit is probably quite a luxury. We can see here the gunner's position from the inside, with what looks like a very beautiful and intricate mechanism for firing the guns. Although despite the impressive engineering that went into this, it still sacrificed firing angles. The position could house either a 30 or a 50 cal. The belly position, found between the trailing edge of the wing and the side blisters, is yet another glazed cupula, with a somewhat similar design to the side positions, and can also house either a 30 or a 50 cal. The bomb bay, meanwhile, used 8 vertical stacks which could hold 600 pounds each, meaning it could carry a maximum bomb load of 4,800 pounds, 2,040 miles, at least internally, which almost certainly exceeded what the Army had meant when they specified a useful load. With a total of 5 single-mount defensive machine guns with a decent amount of modularity, the aircraft was very well defended for its time period, and upon final assembly in 1935, it was clear in hindsight that the new generation was here. Across the world in the span of 6 months in 1935, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, Hawker Hurricane, and Curtiss P-36 Hawk had all taken to the skies. Suddenly, bombers were not the fastest aircraft in the skies anymore. The new era of flush-riveted, monocoque, all-metal aircraft had changed that. It was a historic time, and when the bare metal Model 299 was unveiled to the public in July 1935, people watched. Highly polished, with the tasteful red, white, and blue markings on the wings and tail, the Boeing team had produced a masterclass in contemporary heavy bomber design, and was, for a time being, by far and away the most advanced bomber in the world. Having rolled out of its hangar doors, the waiting public and press were suitably impressed, the Seattle Times reporter Dick Williams famously describing the 15-ton aircraft in front of him as a flying fortress. Boeing apparently rather liked this name, so they quickly trademarked it, and the spur-of-the-moment nickname has been inseparable from the aircraft ever since. It was clear that Boeing had created an aircraft that had implications beyond the original specifications given by the Army. The directive given by the Army, although they didn't say it at the time, had actually been intended for coastal defense against seaborne attack, a role also envisaged by the US Navy. The 299, however, was uncompromisingly a strategic long-range heavy bomber. Whilst the appearance of the Boeing Giant sent shockwaves around America and the rest of the world, testing began, undergoing engine run-ups and general testing to ensure all the key systems worked. On the 28th of July, the 299 was cleared for its first flight and took to the skies at the hands of test pilot Leslie Towers. Over the following weeks, the bomber was subject to intense and thorough testing to ensure its readiness for the US Army Air Corps assessment at Wright Field. Boeing had put a hell of a lot of work into the aircraft, and now they wanted to secure the bulk order of 220. However, a significant issue that had not gone unnoticed was that the initial funding of $275,000 had not even come close to covering the costs of development. By the time the Model 299 rolled out of her hangar, the development costs had racked up to $432,000. Further, the two main competitors to the project, the Martin Model 146 and the Douglas DB1 cost only $85,000 and $99,000 respectively. Meanwhile, the four-engined Boeing cost a whopping $196,000. Four-engined heavies were not necessarily in vogue by this point in aviation history, and US officials were not exactly leaping at the opportunity to spend twice the money on a design layout they weren't completely convinced of. Further, the Model 299 had no shortage of detractors amongst the ranks of the US Army Air Corps. It was believed that a twin-engine design like the Martin or Douglas would be preferable, using their speed as a defense, being able to produce two for every one Boeing, and thus also producing a significantly larger bomb force. Boeing's decision, however, had been against the grain, but it had not been arbitrary. More engines also meant more redundancy and more lifting capacity. In fact, with the payload carried by B-17s by the time the Second World War broke out, the Boeing design had twice the payload-to-engine ratio of the B-18, and more importantly, could carry twice as much with just two more crew members. A couple of B-18s would have to put 12 crew members in combat, and by extension risk of death, to drop 4,000 pounds of bombs onto the enemy, whilst a single B-17 could do the same with only 8 crew members. So, the Army Air Corps' original ideas would turn out to be false economy, and Boeing proved right. But of course it was the early days, and they couldn't have known all this information at the time. On the 20th of August, a couple Boeing engineers, test pilot August Tower, a mechanic, and a Pratt & Whitney employee left Boeing Field in their Model 299, bound for Wright Field, where the official comparison and assessment against the two competitors would take place. Somewhat hilariously, the Model 299 broke a speed record without even trying en route, traveling 2,100 miles at an average speed of 233 miles an hour, thus immediately invalidating the speed concerns before it had even arrived. Upon arrival at Wright Field, the 299 was assigned to Lieutenant Donald Putt, who wasted no time in putting the aircraft through its paces in a series of flights. It was quite soon apparent that the Boeing was by far and away the winner in virtually all aspects. It was noted that the handling, armament, speed, climb, and range were all superior. The Douglas DB1 and Martin B-18 were certainly not bad and would have been considered pretty modern had it not been for the 299 next to them on the tarmac, looking as if it was of a completely different generation than the twin-engine designs beside it. Unfortunately for the prospective aircraft, it was not to be all smooth sailing. On the 30th of October 1935, the aircraft and her crew were readying for a test flight, intended to measure optimal rate of climb at sea level, followed by the time it would take to reach 10,000 feet, and then finally the Model 299 service ceiling at around 20 to 25,000 feet. Prior to the flight, a mechanic had adjusted the carburetors of engines 3 and 4, but due to pressure from the flight crew eager to get going, had neglected to do the same adjustments on engine 1 and 2. Opening up the throttle, the aircraft began to roll along the runway, but developed a list to the left. Making throttle adjustments, the aircraft continued gathering speed, and the 299 continued to more severely swing. After around 17 seconds and 1,000 feet of runway, the aircraft was able to take off, but almost immediately went into an extremely aggressive climb, the nose pointing up some 45 degrees. After having reached 300 feet of altitude, the 299 stalled, yawed to port, and spun out of control, hitting the ground with its port wing, which somewhat cushioned the impact, before the main fuselage hit the ground and crumpled. Miraculously, all of the 7 people aboard the aircraft were able to escape the burning wreck, to a large extent thanks to Lieutenant Robert Giovanoli, who had observed the plane crash, crawled into the mass of twisted metal and fire, and pulled Major Ployer Peter Hill and Boeing pilot Les Towers to safety. Unfortunately, both would succumb to their injuries in the following hours and days, but Giovanoli nevertheless received the Soldier's Medal for his act of bravery, and the other 5 crew did survive. Whilst the burnt-out wreck of the once beautiful aircraft lay on the tarmac at Wright Field, a post-crash investigation revealed that the cause of the crash had been horribly simple. The pilot and co-pilot had forgotten to disable the mechanical ground locks, which essentially stopped the elevator or rudder from moving on the ground, essentially meaning they had absolutely no control once in the air. This lock was controlled from inside the cockpit and had ironically been installed as a safety measure, but had simply been forgotten in the excitement leading up to the flight. Tragically, Les Towers, more familiar with the aircraft than the others on board, had actually noticed that the lock was still engaged as the aircraft began to stall, but couldn't reach it in time. Before his death days later from his injuries, he blamed himself for the crash. The crash directly led to the Air Corps developing checklists that all aircraft crew would have to follow before takeoff, before landing, and after landing, to prevent such tragedies being beholden to something as fallible as human memory. It was the norm that crews would normally complete a checklist of their own before flight, but in the excitement before the flight, it appeared to have slipped their minds. The efforts of the Air Corps universalized the absolute importance of a mandatory checklist, which still exists in all spheres of aviation today, and can trace directly back from this crash. Boeing's bid for the specification ended in a twisted mass of burning metal and the death of 2 aviators. Lacking a second prototype, and with the competition still underway, they were forced to withdraw, the contract ultimately being given to the Douglas DB-1, redesignated the B-18. Recognized as inferior to the Model 299 by virtually everyone, the B-18's career would go on to be fairly short-lived. It simply was not the generational stepping stone that Boeing had produced with their design, and thus was confined to being merely acceptable in a fairly narrow period of the interwar. The story of the Flying Fortress, however, was far from over. Long before the crash, the Army had recognized that the aircraft was brimming with potential, and had even considered putting through an order for 65, way before the competition was over. Douglas was of course relieved, and presumably counted themselves lucky, that somehow they had come away with a bulk order of B-18s in a competition where the Model 299 was competing, whilst Boeing had to be content with the consolation prize, at least for now. The Army ordered 13 improved Model 299s, designated Model 299Bs, which would be changed to the nomenclature YB-17 in November 1936. The order was not the 220 that Boeing had hoped for, but it still injected $4 million into the company, which could of course be put to good use. The YB-17 would not be a huge departure from the Model 299. It would instead build on the success of the previous design, with some upgrades. First, the old 750 horsepower R1690s was switched out for new Wright R1820 Cyclones, upping the power output to 1,000 horsepower per engine, giving the aircraft an overall 33% increase in power. Another key change involved the landing gear, switching out the initial double-leg design for a single-wheel arrangement, which substantially improved ease of maintenance. Once retracted, they would also sit semi-exposed in the wheel well, which had the theoretical advantage of cushioning the aircraft and the crew from serious damage or injury in the case of a belly landing. Otherwise, the YB-17 was externally strikingly similar to its predecessor and retained the Art Deco style. The first YB-17 rolled off the production line on September 30th, 1936, and flew just over a month later on December 2nd. Lasting 55 minutes and without any issues, the aircraft benefited from its new power, and only served to give more speed to an aircraft that had been considered very fast before. The press's interest in the Flying Fortress had apparently not abated, as for its second test flight it was accompanied by its smaller older brother, the Model 247, loaded with journalists and photographers eager to take a picture of the new YB-17 in flight. On the 7th of December, the aircraft had its third test flight, which resulted in a pretty unusual mishap. During taxiing, the pilot had apparently been too liberal with his use of the brakes, which wouldn't normally be an issue due to being cooled by the airflow over the discs, but on this particular flight the undercarriage was retracted immediately after takeoff, still scalding hot, welding themselves together and to the inside of the wheel well once retracted. The flight didn't end up being too long due to the failure of one engine, and another which began to overheat, and so the YB-17 lined up for landing. Striking the ground and sliding 250 feet down the airfield, the test had in fact been somewhat of a success, since it highlighted a design flaw in a careful environment where it could be remedied, and also proved the effectiveness of the semi-retracted wheel configuration, as both the crew and the aircraft were relatively unscathed. Sent for repairs, the politics of the aircraft began heating up as much as the brakes, as a significant amount of short-sighted officials remained stubbornly opposed to the introduction of four-engine designs, vouching for twin-engine bombers as the future. As the performance of the Boeing aircraft had been unequivocally proven to be superior, the only argument left to the detractors was that twin-engine designs were easier to maintain. Despite being a pretty flimsy argument, a lot of the important decision-makers subscribed to it, and Boeing was keenly aware that the project was on thin ice. Any further accidents could spell the end of it. The YB-17, meanwhile, repaired in only a month, also had a couple of modifications made, namely the addition of metal-covered flaps and the addition of de-icing equipment on the wing's leading edges. It was a new year, 1937, and with the first of the YB-17s repaired, Boeing proceeded to complete the remaining 12 airframes, retaining one for testing and trying out modifications. The first Flying Fortresses were now ready for delivery, the first units to operate the aircraft being the 20th, 40th, and 96th Bombing Squadrons. Deliveries beginning on the 1st of March 1937, the main role of the squadrons was initially simply to put the aircraft through the paces of service life, see if they discovered any flaws before its proper introduction as the B-17. The aircraft also cannot be separated from the changing politics of how a bomber was to be used in warfare, which in conjunction with the efforts from General Frank Andrews served to set the groundwork for not only what the B-17 would become, but how it would be used. Moving away from the days of close-quarters ground support, Andrews was firmly behind the new school of thinking that supported strategic bombing, high-altitude, swathes of bombers that could fly fast, fly higher, and defend themselves with significant defensive armament. The capabilities of the YB-17 of course supported Andrews' idea, and so through publicity campaigns and exploiting the all-American image that had become associated with the Flying Fortress in the press, he pushed through his agenda. The three squadrons operating the aircraft, meanwhile, took their task to heart, logging no less than 9,232 flying hours and covering 1.8 million miles without the loss of a single aircraft. The formalized flight checklist also prevented any of the aircraft being lost to pilot forgetfulness, and isolated mechanical faults as a sole variable. And the YB-17 took it easily, gaining the trust of those who flew her as an extremely rugged and dependable aircraft, even in such an early variant. In early 1938, the YB-17s went on a tour of South America, through Brazil, Peru, and Argentina, countries specifically chosen due to suspected Nazi ties. The carefree days of the Model 299 in 1935 were over. War clouds were brewing in Europe, and with every day that passed, the YB-17 looked less and less like an attractive Art Deco symbol of technology, and more like a necessary tool of destruction. This would be reflected in the aircraft design too. With every revision, the aircraft would steadily lose the feminine, streamlined, artistic look that it had become famous for in 1935, and it would become a hardened war machine, gaining battle scars in the form of more turrets, more guns, blisters, and protrusions. The tour in South America would be a flaunting of strength for the US Army Air Corps, but it would also be a huge public relations success. Crowds flocked around the aircraft wherever they landed, as striking to the civilian world as it had been 3 years prior in the States. And yet, for all the achievements, for all the praise of the crews that flew them, for all the mediocrity of the B-18 that had been in service for over 2 years now, the powers that be remained adamantly unconvinced of the suitability of four-engine designs. Air-power doctrine supported the use of twin-engine bombers in conjunction with ground operations, used as close air support and strictly tethered to the ground troops which they would fly in support of. The 1939 and 1940 spending plans limited manufacturers to the production of light and medium aircraft, as well as earmarking the development for close support aircraft. The best efforts of General Frank Andrews had yet to be reflected in any meaningful way, and the ultra-conservatism of the US officials remained, perhaps not strong as ever, but plenty strong enough to put a huge roadblock in the way of serious progress. Andrew, apparently still utterly determined, decided he needed to make a statement that would definitively prove the worth of the concept and of the YB-17 to the Air Corps and to the Navy, who themselves continued to keep the Army in the dark as to their own air power assets and doctrines. On the 12th of May 1938, in a blatant exhibit of showmanship, 3 YB-17s belonging to the 419th Bombardment Squadron took off from their base on the East Coast and headed out over the Atlantic. An audacious navigation exercise, the task would bring them on an interception course with the Italian ocean liner Rex, 725 miles off the east coast of the US. This also served to show to the Italians, and by connection all of the Axis powers, that any approaching fleet would be well within reach of powerful American bombers before they were anywhere close to the coast. Unfortunately, this backfired. Pressured by the embarrassment of the US Navy commanders, Chief of Staff General Malin Craig limited the US Army Air Corps to operations spanning no more than 100 miles off the American coast. This new restriction, although ultimately being fairly short-lived, meant that the order of a 14th YB-17 from the Air Corps came as a surprise to Boeing, who nonetheless were happy to oblige it. Originally intended to test the airframe to near destruction to really get a feel for the upper limits of the aircraft, this turned out to be unnecessary. On the 10th of July 1938, a YB-17 en route to Langley Field was caught out in an extremely vicious thunderstorm. Buffeted around by the extreme weather, the crew managed to guide the aircraft to its destination successfully and land without incident. But an investigation by Boeing engineers after the flight revealed that the wings had survived an astonishing load factor of roughly 166,000 pounds, around the weight of 12 African elephants. This was an unbelievable feat for the aircraft, and an ordeal that would have destroyed virtually any design had the storm been half as strong. The Flying Fortress continued to live up to its name and prove its incredible durability time and time again, a trait that it would become famous for in the coming years. Anyway, this basically meant that the 14th airframe no longer needed to be tested for durability, as that had already well and truly been put through its paces, so it was decided to use it as a testbed to develop the aircraft's performance further. Up until this point, all the aircraft had been fitted with a single-stage supercharger, which was about par for the course in 1935, but was beginning to be an untenable design choice for a long-range bomber in mid to late 1938. Subsequently, the test bed was fitted with General Electric superchargers, mounted to the exhaust of the Wright Cyclones on the upper engine nacelles. This was initially a failure, but by simply moving it to the underside of the nacelle, the hoped results were achieved, in a successful high-altitude test flight on November 20th, 1938. This supercharged aircraft was designated the YB-17A and would be the sole example of its kind. Delivered to Wright Field in January 1939, the YB-17A turned out to be even more impressive than originally thought. At 25,000 feet, the Cyclones were still managing to produce 800 horsepower and propelling the aircraft to 295 miles an hour, more than the Model 299 could have managed at sea level 4 years before. However, the performance of this aircraft had never come without a cost, and so adding the supercharger system to the YB-17 cost $100,000, which was paid for out of the company's own pocket. However, with the upfront cost out of the way, and Boeing keen to get their money's worth, the superchargers were fitted to all subsequent YB-17s, which no doubt was an important addition. Finally, after proving itself time and time again, the supercharged YB-17A, with its excellent high-altitude performance, finally convinced the Air Corps and the aircraft's detractors of the huge strategic advantage that the aircraft could represent, and a further 10 17As were ordered. Simultaneously, the YB-17s finally underwent their name change, and from here on out would be referred to as Boeing B-17s, the name with which the aircraft would go down in history. I hope you enjoyed this first part of the deep dive in the development of the B-17. If so, let me know and I'll probably do more of these kinds of videos in the future. And be on the lookout for the part 2 of this video, which will go out on the 1st of September, though of course patrons get early access. Speaking of which, a huge thanks to my patrons on screen now for supporting the channel, and thank you so much for watching this video of Aviation Deep Dive. Consider liking and subscribing for more weekly content, and please also consider supporting us on Patreon. See you in the skies.